yeah, sometimes if they're running on the WebEx and the like, it can create some issues. So please let me know if link doesn't come through. But welcome everyone. Welcome to a Taste of CIDER, as we've coined the webinar today. And the reason for that really is a step into the CIDER conference, which is scheduled for the 10th and 11th of May in Adelaide. Will be about. So today I'll be your host. My name is Adrian Lloyd, and I'm the Next Generation Network Liaison for the C6 panel. And outside of my CIGRE activities, I am the Technical Program Lead of Emerging Opportunities within Eureka, which is part of the Energy Queensland group. I'd actually like to start today by conducting an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land across Australia on which we meet today, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters, and community. Now, normally I'm joining you from the land of the Turrbal and the CIGRE people in southeast Queensland in that Brisbane River Basin. But today I'm actually a guest of the Darug people in southwest Sydney. So I'd like to acknowledge the lands that I gather on today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that the lands and waters that stretch across our communities was and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. So moving on to some general housekeeping today, I'd ask that audience members all remain muted throughout, except for our presenters, of course. If I do see participants unmuting, whether it's by accident, I will look to mute you as Q&A will be handled through a separate system today. This session is being recorded, so if you're not able to stay for the full time, or if you have others that are asking to hear about it, a recording should be made available, and keep an eye on the CIGRE Australia communications for that. Like I mentioned, questions today are going to be handled through Slido. First time that I've used Slido, but I've seen it successfully run in the past. And speaking of, those details can be found here. Sorry, someone mustn't be muted. Hang on. Can't find. So if you would like to partake in the Q&A today, please either go to slido.com, enter in that code there. Alternatively, on your phone, scan that QR code, and it'll give us an opportunity to have a really nice interactive Q&A. Questions will be passed to our presenters at the end of each presentation. And the opportunity, if you ask a question, will be there to vote some of the questions that come through up to the top to make sure that we hit the most interesting and topical questions that are put forward. So that brings me on to our presenters today. I'd like just to quickly do a bit of an introduction about them and their topics before I then hand over to Terry, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the CIDER conference coming up in May as a bit of a warm-up. So today's first presenter will be Dr. Jenny Reese. Dr. Reese leads AEMO's work program and operational aspects. Oh, sorry, was that a comment? No, if anyone who's unmuted, could you please mute yourself? I can't do it whilst I'm sharing my screen, sorry. Works on program on the operational aspects of the integration of distribution energy resources. And she'll be presenting on operating a secure system with 100% distributed PV, which is really looking at the work that AEMO has been undertaking to enable a secure power system operation during those periods where we have 100% of DER supply in the network. And following that, we'll also be hearing from Peter Kilby and Dr. Terese Milford, who are both senior engineers at Energy Queensland, working in the Energex and Energy Network areas. And they'll be presenting about the DER enablement using state estimation and dynamic operating envelopes, and more specifically looking to cover how the transition from passive PV connections in the Queensland network more to active DER connections, and covering the current mechanisms and looking at the future direction for those aspects. So with those pieces covered, I'd like to hand over now to Terry, because you'd like to talk to us a little bit about CIDER 2022.
Thanks, Adrian. So you need to give me access so I can share my screen here.
Sure thing. Thought I had, but if I had, here we go.
It won't let me.
Hopefully it goes now.
Oh, there we go. Yep.
Excellent. Okay, over to you, Terry. Thank you.
I'm getting there. So, sorry, Adrian. Okay. Thanks, Adrian. So just very briefly, as Adrian said, for those that don't know me, Peter Kilby, I'm the CEO of CIGRE Australia. And I just wanted to quickly say a couple of words about our upcoming CIDER event in Adelaide. As Adrian indicated, that we put this particular session on just to give you a bit of a taste for what to expect in Adelaide. We're pretty excited about being able to put it on after the couple of years break due to COVID and not being able to hold the physical event. So and for those that have been at CIGRE events before, you'll realise that our events typically have hands-on people that are experts generally in the field are talking about. It's always a practical orientated forum and sessions, and some of the topics, as you can see there, that we'll be covering in the actual CIDER event coming up in May in Adelaide. The committee is working on putting together the presentations. Currently we have 22 accepted presentations with a couple more to come. So it certainly promises to be a very jam-packed and informative event. Just briefly there, we've got managed to secure a couple of really interesting keynote speakers, Brendan and Bruce, talking on the topics that you can see on that slide. We've also had a number of panel sessions. We've got a contest lined up between Ken Ash and Jenny Gannon on microgrids, hope or here to stay. So it should be a very interesting discussion. And again, we'll have opportunity there for audience participation. Our young engineers, the NGN, have also be running some sessions and panel presentations during the event. And we've also got some exhibitors and sponsors. And I'd just like to point out Schweitzer Engineering or Schweitzer Labs, Dynamic Ratings, GridSight, University of Wollongong, and the Transmission and Distribution Magazine organisation have finally come on board to date as sponsors for that event. So they'll have stands there to talk to the delegates. And by the time we get to May, I'm sure we'll have some other exhibitors as well that we're currently talking to but haven't quite yet committed. So it'll be held in Glenelg in Adelaide, a beautiful seaside spot of Glenelg, 10th and 11th of May. And as I said, we've got some really good speakers and there's lots of presentations that the committee are currently putting the program together. In terms of pricing, again, all this information is on our website under our events tab. But you should be particularly interested in, if you're in on this session, is that the early bird rates, which are substantially cheaper than a standard rate, close on the 10th of March. So it gives you about a week or so to get organised, jump on the website and sign up. Again, it's shaping up to be a very interesting and informative event, and it'd be really good for people to be able to get together and start establishing and re-establishing their contacts in the industry. Just quickly, for those who may not have been to one of our events before, the dinner we have, the networking dinner, is actually a stand-up dinner on the first evening, and it's will be held within the exhibition space. So whilst people are chatting and having a nibble and a drink, they can also go and also talk to the exhibitors and the sponsors at the same time to enhance the opportunity to get to know each other and find out what they can offer and establish your contacts. So again, the information, the registration link are on our website, CIGREaustralia.org.au. Go to the events tab, and it's pretty easy process. Click register, and it will step you through the process. So that's what I'd like to say. So again, thanks to the 150 or so that have signed in for today. I'm sure you'll find the two presentations very interesting. And also I'd like to thank Adrian for his work in helping set up today and offering to compare the event. So thanks very much, Adrian. Back to you.
Very welcome, Terry. So I'm just going to, one more time, just for those that have joined late, share the Slido details. So if you do want to ask any questions during today's Q&A, I'll pop that up one more time before I pass over to our first presenter. So there's those Slido details, the number being 115515. If you go to slido.com, otherwise scan that QR code. It'd be great to see plenty of people on the Q&A today. Oh dear. Jenny, if you're able to hear me, are you able to share your screen?
I can hear you.
Excellent.
It's
Sorry.
saying that I need the organizer to make me the presenter.
Yes, I'm sure it is. I'm just going to do this a little bit on the fly, I'm afraid. And everything's just running a touch slow on my end. So thank you everyone for your patience. All right, hopefully that is now allowing you to share.
Okay, I've just shared my screen. Let me know when that comes up.
Just waiting on my end.
Seems to have dropped it again. It's
Okay.
telling me again the organizer needs to make me the presenter again.
Give it one more go. It's probably due to a bit of lag on my end.
Okay, it's telling me I'm sharing now.
It's coming through. Haven't quite. There we go. I can see the slides. Thank you very much for your patience, everyone, and take it away, Jenny.
All right. Hi, everybody. So my name is Jenny Reese. I'm the manager of our operational DER integration team at AEMO, with responsibility for looking at how we integrate distributed resources and operate a power system with potentially up to 100% of the power coming from distributed sources, which is a pretty exciting goal. So we are now looking at very substantial proportions of our demand, our customer demand supplied by distributed resources in some periods. This chart's showing you the maximum proportion of underlying demand that has applied by distributed PV in each region. You can see for South Australia, we are very close to periods with 100% of demand in South Australia being supplied by distributed PV in some periods. And Victoria, Queensland and New South Wales sitting at around 30 to 40% in periods as well and growing steeply. So certainly a very significant proportion of our power system now. And this is just showing you that day that we saw in South Australia on the 21st of November, where we saw 92% of underlying demand supplied by rooftop small-scale solar PV. This is the amount of energy that was being supplied by rooftop PV. With 1.8 gigawatts, that should be. Just getting some echo coming through. I'm not sure if that's coming through others. Adrian, is that a new person joining us that we're able to mute? Awesome, sorted. So 1.8 gigawatts of distributed PV now, growing at about 20 megawatts per month in South Australia. And we've seen periods with operational demand, the demand that's met by traditional large-scale generation, as low as 104 megawatts in that period. So an incredible operational range where we're looking at maximum demand periods up around 3 gigawatts, going down to only 100 megawatts in some periods. So a very different power system to operate. So my team is aiming to answer these questions. How do we operate a power system with only distributed resources in some periods? What challenges are going to arise when we try to do that? And how do we address those challenges to remove barriers to continuing growth in distributed resources? And this is just showing you the forward projection for South Australia in terms of the percentage of PV demand met by PV in those minimum periods. And we're not forecasting that it will slow down. In some scenarios, that we'll continue seeing that massive growth in PV with very significant negative demand in South Australia, exporting to other regions. So we've identified so far 4 major areas where we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we can operate that power system properly. And I'll talk through the first 3 of these. I won't touch too much on the last one here today. So these are around the unintended disconnection of distributed PV and disturbances, making sure that we've got sufficient load to operate the necessary units to deliver essential services to the grid, managing our under-frequency load shedding and making sure that that backup system works properly, and being able to perform a system restart in the event that we do have a system black event. And distributed PV intersects across all of these. They're all different but related issues, and each requires different approaches to handle them. So looking at challenge 1, the unintended disconnection of distributed PV. So we've seen, and we've collected a lot of data now across a lot of different disturbances, and we've seen that we can have up to 40% of the distributed PV in a region disconnecting in response to power system disturbances. Particularly severe faults and phase angle jumps can cause distributed PV to disconnect en masse across a power system. That can happen in conjunction with the trip of a generating unit, a large generating unit, which means that it's adding to our largest credible contingency that we have to manage. And we project with growing levels of PV, these can rapidly become unmanageably large. And eventually we won't be able to operate the power system securely anymore unless we take action to manage this. So this is just some examples. This is an event that actually occurred in the Swiss, where we had a fault on the 17th October 2020. This was a period with a lot of PV operating. Normally what we see with a fault is that load will trip off in a severe fault, and we'll see operational demand drop down after that event. But we're now seeing, for high PV periods, load will jump up a decent amount. We've seen this consistently across a bunch of events. Load will jump up because of PV disconnecting. It's more than offsetting the amount of load that is disconnected. This bottom chart here is showing, looking at data that we've got from a company called Solar Analytics, who have monitoring, third-party monitoring on rooftop PV systems. They now have coverage of tens of thousands of systems across the NEM, and we've looked at the percentage of sites that we see disconnecting in power system disturbances across the grid. And this is just plotted as a function of the minimum voltage that was recorded on a single phase to give an indication of how severe the fault was. And you can see that in these more severe disturbances, we're seeing quite amounts of PV tripping off, up to around 10% in the worst case that we saw here. But more typically around 10 to 20% of PV systems tripping off for milder faults. And this graph here is just showing you how much this matters in terms of our system outcomes. So this is another event that happened in the Swiss, in Western Australia, where we had a fault and a unit trip on the 2nd of January 2021. So that caused a large contingency, with frequency then dropping after that event. In the black here is the actual frequency that was measured in that event. And again, this was a high PV period. You see frequency dropped down just below 49 hertz. And then there's another event that occurred here. We believe that's PV tripping off in response to the frequency dropping below 49 hertz. And there was a bunch of PV that tripped in this original event as well, which exacerbated this contingency event. This was a very severe event with frequency falling below 49 hertz. The different lines here are different modeling scenarios that we've looked at, and the only difference between these is the amount of PV that we estimate to have tripped off, with the blue being a lower bound estimate and the red being an upper bound estimate, and the orange being our best guess of what actually happened in this event. And so you can see how dramatically different the power system outcomes are in terms of whether frequency bottoms out at a reasonable level and recovers, or is potentially going through to a level where it can't recover, just due to the difference in the PV behavior. So to address this, we've been working on this for some years now to improve DER ride-through standards. So this is particularly under Australian Standard 4777, where it specifies, in the previous standard, in the 2015 standard, it has ride-through standards that are specified, although they were a little ambiguous and there was no testing for those under the 2015 standard. So we've now introduced, it's been quite a long process, and there's probably many on the call here today who are involved in this process, so thank you for all of your efforts to get this over the line. We've now introduced a new standard, the 2020 AS4777 standard, which became mandatory from December 2021, which has much more detailed specifications of the requirements for ride-through of disturbances, so that inverters will not disconnect when we have these sorts of disturbances. That should apply then to any new inverters installed after that date, and we are very much hoping will reduce significantly the amount of disconnection that we see. But there are big question marks around compliance with those standards. We've seen evidence that we may not have a foolproof system in terms of making sure that inverters behave this way in the field, and just big question marks as well around whether that is actually effective and sufficient. So we are waiting and watching to see the next big disturbance and how they behave. We still, however, this only applies to new inverters, so we still have almost 2 gigawatts in South Australia and a very large amount across the NEM of legacy systems installed under the old standard, which we still need to manage. So we're doing that with a combination of network constraints, so that we're operating the network within stable limits, accounting for the larger contingency sizes that we now have in high PV periods, making sure that we enable sufficient frequency control reserves so that we can manage those larger contingencies, and updating our operating procedures so that we take additional action when required. Particularly this occurs around periods where we've got major line outages happening, in which case we can't handle as larger contingency sizes. So we are now watching that very actively in South Australia. In some periods, we need to revoke permission for line outages to occur where we can't handle the contingency sizes because of the amount of PV that will be online. And as a very last resort, we have procedures in place to curtail off distributed PV systems if need be, because there's no other way to maintain a secure power system with the amount of PV that's operating. And so all of this is informed by estimates of PV tripping behaviour from the existing fleet, which I'll talk about more in a second. But just a note on compliance. I mentioned that we've seen evidence of inverters not complying in the field. This is just some of the evidence we've collected around that. So this chart up the top here is showing you the responses of PV inverters that we recorded based on the data sets from Solar Analytics, where they're recording systems less than 100 kilowatts, thousands of them across the NEM. And this was looking in a particular event that happened where we saw an overfrequency. So you can see here in the grey, the overfrequency event that occurred. It went up to about 50.4 to 50.6 hertz, which is in the realm where the 2015 standard specifies that inverters should have an overfrequency droop response if it goes above 50.25. So that's the grey sort of blue line here. So frequency definitely went above that level and was sustained above that level for quite some time in this event. And we should have seen inverters drop down along this line. And you can see in the green here, well, many of the inverters actually did do that. They did that very, very well. So certainly we've got lots of inverters out there that are performing as they should. These numbers here are showing you the percentage that fall into that category across a bunch of different disturbances that we've seen where frequency exceeded these levels. And we're seeing pretty consistently across all these different disturbances, here, the ones responding as specified, we're seeing about 30 to 50% of them in these events are responding as they should, according to that green line, dropping down and reliably delivering that overfrequency droop as they should under the 2015 standard. But worryingly, we're seeing a similar amount, another 30 to 50%, that are not responding at all. So that's these ones in the red here that just merrily went along, ignoring that frequency event entirely. And these are inverters that were installed under the 2015 standard that specifies they should be dropping down. So that's quite worrying. That's a very large percentage of inverters that were not responding in these events. And that's somewhat unknown as to why they were not responding, whether they were not set to the correct standard or whether they, for some reason, whatever the reason is that they're not doing that is somewhat unknown. So we are waiting with bated breath to see how inverters respond across not just overfrequency droop, but all of the different parameters in the new 2020 standard to see how they actually perform in the field. So this will be a really critical step to observe to see that they are actually reducing disconnection rates with that new standard. All of this is underpinned by very, very large data sets that we've had to work with to understand what tens of thousands of inverters are doing to get a decent sample and understand what the fleet of millions and millions of devices are doing across the NEM. These charts here are showing you data that we collected as part of the investigation of the event on the 25th of May 2021, where there was the CIDER unit explosion in Queensland and significant under-frequency load shedding in that event. The circles here are showing the responses of the PV inverters by postcode, and the pie is the percentage of inverters in that postcode that had these different types of responses. The blue ones rode through, which is the desired behaviour. The red ones, we believe, dropped out based on a UFLS disconnection of the whole feeder that the PV was connected to. So that's also a desired response because those feeders were cut off as part of the load shedding mechanism to recover the frequency. The black ones are the ones that disconnected, the percentage of inverters in that postcode that disconnected. So you can see a very large concentration of them around here in northern New South Wales, and another concentration of them are here in Queensland. Those areas are very closely correlated with where we saw very low voltages on the grid. So you can see here sort of the epicenter with these are the per unit measurements that were measured on the transmission network, down at 0.2 per unit or 0.3 per unit, very low voltages, which we would fully expect to cause disconnection of inverters. And similarly up here near where the CIDER units were, low voltages recorded, which we would expect to cause inverters to disconnect under the older standards. We're very much hoping that under the future standard, we will not be seeing those disconnections associated with low voltages, and that those inverters will be able to ride through. We're working to improve our data sets on this to improve our visibility of inverter behaviour. All of this is underpinning some very significant interventions that we need to make in how the power system is operated. And the more accurate the data we have, the more we can reduce uncertainty around what they're going to do, what the inverters will do. We can have more confidence in exactly what intervention measures need to be put in place, and we can reduce the need for overly conservative intervention because we've got accurate data about what they're going to do. So we're working closely with University of New South Wales to improve our methods on this through Project Match. And if there's people on the line who have data sets that you think may be relevant for looking at how inverters are behaving, we would love to talk to you and get you involved in Project Match. So please message me afterwards if you're in that category and you'd love to get involved. All of this data around inverter behaviour feeds into our power system models. So we've been working very hard over the past few years to build models in the various power system modelling platforms, PSSE, PSCAT and Power Factory being the main ones that we're using at AMO at the moment, to make sure that we can represent the behaviour of the power system, including distributed PV. These models underpin a very large amounts of power system operation. They're used for defining the secure technical envelope, including the network constraints, system requirements and so on. They're also used in our planning studies looking ahead where we need to invest in the network and so on, things like inertia requirements, system requirements, and SCAS assessments and so on. And they're used for assessing connections to make sure that generators are connected properly and will behave properly. Until recently, our models did not include any representation of distributed PV except as a negative load, and our load models were updated more than 20 years ago, and load has changed considerably since that time. So load and distributed PV now represent more than half of the power system, if you think about it. So the way that they behave is critically important to include accurately in those models. So we've been looking at a major update to develop PV models and also update our load models. This process started with an international review, selecting best practice models from international sources. And then we've been through a very significant exercise to develop parameters to understand what kinds of inverters are out there based on data sets such as from the Clean Energy Regulator or the Australian Photovoltaic Institute, understanding what vintage of inverters are located where in the network, at each individual bus in the network. Then looking at what the inverter trip settings might be. So tripping on things like voltage, rate of change of frequency, high voltage, tripping on frequency based on various different sources for older inverters and newer inverters. And then looking at the control parameters as well, because there's controlled behaviors we need to capture, things like volt-var response, frequency ROC response, and so on, defined under various standards and in DNSP requirements. So pulling all of that together, we built from the bottom up, built a picture of what we think these inverters should do. And then we validated them against historical disturbances. So checking the performance of the models. This is showing some high-speed data measured at a particular location for a particular historical fault. The actual data recorded is in the black. And then the old model that we've been using is in the light blue, which is producing this very fast recovery and this big spike. The newer model that we've been developing is in the purple here. And you can see that it's showing a much better representation of the slower recovery that we see, although a little bit of overshoot happening. And this has also been checked against measuring whether it actually accurately predicts the amount of load loss and PV loss that we see in these events. So this is showing against SCADA data of the total load in the region, which is not the best data source. We would much prefer to have higher speed data sources, but unfortunately it's the only data source we've got, summing up SCADA measurements. But it is, our models are representing reasonably well the amount of load loss and PV loss that we see in these events. So it's been a really considerable effort from the team to put these models together and validate them. And we're now at the point where we'll be sharing those with NSPs. So for those on the line who work at TNSPs in particular and are involved with using these kinds of models, if you're interested in being involved in that process of the review and due diligence assessment of these models, we would love to talk to you. We are embarking on that process right now. This is showing you an assessment of the performance of the models for all the different historical disturbances that we've looked at. These top ones are nighttime disturbances, and this is the amount of load loss that was actually measured in the dot with the error bar around it, and the bar is showing you what our model has represented. So you can see that the model's doing a decent job of hitting targets for most of these, most of them within the error bar range, although noting we've got some pretty big error bars around some of these. These events at the bottom here are the daytime events, where it's showing the performance of the load model in the grey, the PV model in the yellow, and the overall combined contingency size in the red. So you can see for most of these disturbances, it's doing a decent job. Particularly, it can tell the difference where we've got no PV and load loss. The model can represent that accurately compared to ones where we had higher levels of PV and load loss. But there are events certainly where it's not quite within range, so lots of room for improvement. We think these models are accurate to around plus or minus 25% of the contingency size. And a lot of the uncertainty is actually uncertainty in the input data sets. And to improve these further, we really need better data to, particularly things around load composition, the behavior of PV, and more high-speed network measurements to be able to get a better picture of what's actually going on down in the network. So again, really keen to talk to anyone who would like to get involved in the process of refining these models, because they do have very significant implications. Once these models are reviewed, we'll be rolling them out to update our real-time operations. So you will start to see implications in things like network constraints being updated, frequency reserves being updated, and you'll also start to see changes coming through in planning studies like our inertia assessments, system strength assessments, and so on. So going to flow through into a whole bunch of areas progressively as we work it through. So really keen to talk to people who have interest in being involved in improving these models. So on to challenge 2, and I will talk less about the subsequent ones. The first one was a big one. So challenge 2 is around just having enough demand so that we can operate enough units to provide essential system services. So this chart here is showing you the minimum operational demand for the entire NEM. So we've summed up all of the demand around the entire NEM in actual history and then forward. And this is showing amount of that demand that is met by distributed PV. So we've seen periods with 30 to 40% of demand met by distributed PV across the whole NEM, and we're projecting that growing very substantially over the next 5 years or so, depending on which scenario you're in. And this shaded area here is showing you the minimum operational demand that we need to keep online the synchronous units that are providing essential services for at the moment, for the NEM at the moment. So that includes inertia, system control, and voltage control services that at the moment we rely on synchronous units being online to provide those services. See, we're getting down into levels of demand that is well inside that range and even dropping below that range over the next 5 to 6 years. So what that's saying is that in some periods, we may no longer be able to, if we don't make some changes, we would no longer be able to operate with all of those essential services delivered to the NEM with the levels of PV that we're anticipating in those lowest demand periods. That's an alarmingly short timeline. There's certainly things that we can do to address this. The first of those that we can do is to investigate how to address this in various planning processes. So there's definitely ways you can drop this line down by getting those services from other places. So we can use synchronous condensers, for example, to provide system strength and inertia. We've recently, or Electronet has recently commissioned synchronous condensers in South Australia, which are providing a lot of those services now. Large batteries are also very capable providers of frequency control, and all of those will drop this line down so that we can operate with lower levels of operational demand. The other things that we can do is make sure that the ability to actively manage distributed PV in these low demand periods. These low demand periods occur extremely rarely. They're only on really perfect storm days with perfect weather conditions, very low demand, usually a public holiday or a weekend. It's very rare, and so it may actually be an appropriate management strategy in the near term to just curtail off some of the distributed PV for a brief window of time in these very low demand periods. And also worth noting that what I've shown you here is all system normal conditions. These thresholds move up considerably if we have made line outages or units out where the system doesn't have as much resilience. That means we need potentially more flexibility, more units online, and have less ability to run the power system. So having the ability to actively manage PV through those sorts of periods, if there are line outages or other extreme events going on, is also a really good preventative measure. So again, just to emphasize, these are really rare periods. So this is showing you the count of hours below 6 gigawatts for the whole NEM, which is about this threshold level that we're starting to get into the realm where some sort of intervention may be required. You can see we're only talking very rare periods, only a few hours where it would get down to that level, although it does escalate quickly. So this is suggesting that rather than significant network investment, it may be suitable just to curtail some PV for some brief periods of time while this is a very rare issue. And this is just showing you an example of that minimum demand day in history, 2020, and then projecting forward through the middle of the day, falling down into that very low demand period for a few hours. So AEMO is proposing that we introduce an emergency backstop PBCatalan capability across the NEM, which would give us the ability to curtail distributed PV when required for system security. This is analogous to load shedding, so we're definitely not proposing this would be a regular thing that we would use day to day. It's really just saying we don't have the ability, we will undertake load shedding in periods where there's extreme grid conditions happening to maintain power system security, and at the moment we do not have the equivalent capability to shed PV. So we don't have the ability to do load shedding at the moment with the way that the power system is operating right now. So we need to put that capability in place, and it would be used only as a last resort after all other measures have been exhausted. And we anticipate that being very rare. That can be very simple. It doesn't need to be very sophisticated. It's really just some way of communicating with inverters so they can be turned off in these rare periods if necessary. We fully anticipate we want to develop much more sophisticated capabilities down the track where we can integrate distributed resources into the NEM much more thoroughly. But what we're seeing here is that we do have a very urgent need to put in place just some simple capabilities, which can then be a stepping stone to those more sophisticated capabilities. In parallel, we absolutely need to explore other ways of providing essential services in those minimum demand periods. So as I was mentioning, things like large batteries, synchronous condensers, and other ways that we can deliver essential services without synchronous units online. And we need to look at how we develop our market so that we can bring distributed resources fully into the market with those sophisticated capabilities. So all of that should be done in parallel, but we need to put this backstop in just so that we can maintain system security while we do all of that. So we're anticipating a whole suite of solutions to look at integrating DER into the market. A whole lot of market frameworks, probably trials initially, and then looking at full market integration over the next few years. And then anticipating longer term, we're going to see things like major storage, electric vehicles, load response, potentially new types of load coming in to soak up all this excess free energy that we have longer term. But underpinning that, to make sure that we've got the technical foundations in place to support it. In the near term, very near term, the next few years, we really need to implement emergency backstop capabilities for inverters so that we can turn them off in the equivalent of load shedding if we need to. And that will be an essential underpinning for the coming period. And then looking at things like synchronous condensers, fast frequency response from batteries, increased interconnection perhaps, and network investment to make sure that we can technically support the power system. In thinking longer term about integrating DER into our grid, I know there's a lot of discussion and work on this through processes like the scheduled light process, for example. This is a big open question as to how will we integrate DER into our automated dispatch systems. If we're running 100% of the grid on distributed resources in certain periods, we do need to coordinate that, and it will need to be integrated into our dispatch systems, ultimately into NEMD, the NEM dispatch engine. There's big question marks around how we would do that. I've got on the screen here just one possible framework that could be used to do this. So at the moment, TNSPs provide transmission limits to AEMO, and that's then integrated via constraints into our dispatch engine. And generators provide bids into the dispatch engine, which then calculates, based on everybody's bids and those transmission limits, who gets dispatched to what level, and those targets are then sent back to generators. So one possible way of integrating in DER is through aggregators that would act in the same way as a generator. They'd provide bids into the dispatch engine and receive dispatch targets, which they're then responsible for meeting. And aggregators would have information about where their DER assets are and what their customer preferences are. And also information about the distribution limits in that part of the network where their assets are through operating envelopes or something similar coming from DNSPs. So aggregators can take on board all of that information about the distribution limits and their customer preferences, work out what they want to offer, depending on what the price may be, how many megawatts they want to be generating at, offer that into the dispatch engine, and then receive their dispatch targets, and then meet those, kind of handling all those different bits of information. That's one possible way that it could be managed. I know there's other possible methods under consideration as well. There's a whole lot of question marks around technically how this would work. So we've got to figure out things like, how are we going to formulate constraints that incorporate distributed resources? Probably that will need to be considered in sub-regional zones somehow. It's much more complex than when we're working with a large generator. We know exactly where it is, and it can be then incorporated into how it influences transmission limits and constraints. We're going to need to work that out with distributed resources. And how that scales over time as an aggregator's resources are changing. How would we update their registration in the market? Looking at whether we have this done on a device level or a site level, considering how we have real-time telemetry. At the moment, we can look at what a large generator is doing through the data measurements for that generator in real time, which is quite important for operational awareness for our control room. We need similar visibility of what distributed resources are doing, and at the moment we don't have that in place. So a whole lot of questions that need to be answered around how this process is ultimately going to work. Bringing distributed resources to the fore as a major contributor to the power system, and therefore needing them to participate in some of these processes in a more active way than they have been in the past. So again, very keen to talk to anyone who has thoughts about how this would work, because it's a big challenge to work out. Challenge 3 then, and the last one that I'll speak to today, is around our under-frequency load shedding schemes. So under-frequency load shedding is the safety net that we use to arrest a very severe under-frequency event when we have a trip of multiple generating units, for example. It relies on the controlled disconnection of loads in less than a second. So it's usually around 200 to 300 milliseconds that we expect those relays to respond, to very quickly rebalance a large supply-demand imbalance. So it's an automated shedding of load to correct a very severe frequency disturbance. So how this works under normal circumstances, we've got frequency sitting at 50 Hertz, load and generation are balanced, and we've got relays sitting in the distribution network normally, with load being supplied from the grid. If we see a bunch of generation trip, the frequency will drop very quickly, and when it falls below 49 Hertz, that under-frequency relay, the many relays in the grid will detect that and will open the circuits to disconnect those loads. That drops a bunch of load off the network and hopefully will arrest the frequency decline and assist with restoring it back to 50. Now, in a period with lots of distributed resources, we have potentially a lot of generation on this feeder that's supplying that local load, so there's no load on this grid. Now, when we see generation drop off, frequency will drop, the relay will still detect that and will still open the circuit, but we're not seeing a drop in load associated with that. So essentially, the under-frequency load shedding will not function under these conditions. We're not getting that restoration or the rebalancing of load and generation. And even further, if we now have more PV on that circuit and the circuit is operating in reverse flows, as frequency drops, the relay will still detect that and it will still open the circuit, but now it's disconnected something that was a net generator rather than a net load, and that will actually send frequency further down. So it will actually exacerbate the frequency disturbance rather than helping to correct it. Now, we are looking at reverse flow blocking or dynamic arming of relays, which will mean that the relay will be detecting if the circuit is in reverse flows and it will disarm that circuit, which doesn't bring back the original functionality of the UFLS, but it will at least stop it from operating in reverse and exacerbating the frequency decline. So we're now very actively looking at this with in South Australia with SA Power Networks, and hopefully we'll get that implemented soon. So to summarise, there's a number of challenges with our under-frequency load shedding. It should be operating on a circuit to disconnect a net load, but as we have a reduction in that load due to it being supplied locally, the UFLS becomes less effective. And when we get even more PV on the circuit and it starts going into reverse flows, it will actually exacerbate a frequency decline. A further complication too is that the PV itself will disconnect when there's a frequency disturbance, and that can also exacerbate the frequency decline. So we're essentially running without a safety net at the moment in South Australia, because the UFLS load in South Australia has now reached negative 110 megawatts. So that means that the entire summed up load in South Australia that's on under frequency load shedding is in the negative, now running very well and truly into reverse flows. That happened in November. It should be up around a gigawatt or so. And we're seeing this happening not just in South Australia, but across most regions. So these are actual values measured in 2020. We saw Victoria get as low as 30% of underlying load, and it should be up around 60%. Queensland as low as 41%, and New South Wales as low as 46% of underlying load. So these are all in the middle of the day in very low demand periods. We're seeing UFLS load dropping considerably right across the NEM. And we're projecting by 2023, with the amount of PV going in, that will drop even further, getting down to very low levels in Victoria, and around 30% in Queensland and New South Wales, which is certainly in the realm where this would be problematic if we had another major event like the CIDER event that happened in May last year, for example. So we're already working very actively in South Australia to remediate this. We have added a bunch more customers. Oh, I'm just getting some sound coming through. Someone on the line has not muted.
Can everyone please mute?
We've added a bunch more customers. We've added a bunch more customers into the Australian UFLS. We're looking at the dynamic arming of the scheme.
If everyone could please mute, you're interrupting the presentation right now. I will. Someone on the phone. Yeah, it sounds like it. Call at 10.
So we're implementing a bunch of solutions for this in South Australia, adding more customers into the scheme, dynamically arming relays that are in reverse flows. We're using some additional network constraints to manage interconnector flows in periods where we know UFLS is low. And we're quite actively working with SA Power Networks to procure some replacement services. So if anyone is interested in potentially being involved in that, we would also love to talk to you. SA Power Networks distributed a discussion paper recently, and we had a workshop to discuss how will we replace under-frequency load shedding in a world with very high levels of distributed PV. We're looking for any options to assist with frequency control in very rare events. So we're talking less than once per year where we might see a UFLS trigger. Very rare events where we need to have a response either to reduce load or increase generation. So very keen to talk to anyone who's got ideas about how we might do that. Just a note on dynamic arming. So this is dynamically arming feeders such that they're disabling the relay if they're in reverse flows. We think that very considerably improves the situation in South Australia. So this is showing the load on a very low demand day as it would be on the UFLS without dynamic arming, and what we can achieve if we implement dynamic arming to push that back up. It gets us up to somewhere between 100 and 200 megawatts of load in those very low demand periods, where it should be up around 10 times that, a gigawatt, but it's a heck of a lot better than having it down at negative 500 megawatts. And that benefit becomes greater and greater as more PV comes in. So it stabilizes the UFLS essentially at around that 100 to 200 megawatt level, rather than having it continue to decline into very negative territory. So an extremely important intervention to have that reverse flow blocking put in place. So to summarize, there's clearly a considerable amount of work required to get our grid into shape so that we can run with up to 100% of energy supplied by DER in the NEM and the Swiss. That is very much our objective. We want to make sure that we can operate that grid securely and put in place all the measures that we need to be able to do that. So we can remove barriers to ongoing growth in distributed resources. The lessons learned so far is that it is really important that we identify and address these technical challenges early. The earlier we address them, identify them and start to get measures in place, the easier everything is. It is extremely difficult to remediate if we take action too late. So things become very expensive if it involves having to go out to millions of customer sites to change settings, but much easier done if we can identify that very early. So very keen to work with anyone who's got thoughts on any of that. And there's lots of information and reports available on the AEMO website. If you just search for AEMO DER operations, you'll find a lot of information and reports there. So that's all from me. Thank you. Back to you, Adrian.
Awesome. Thank you very much, and apologies for the interruptions there. It's difficult to find those that were unmuting or not muting themselves. So thank you for powering on through. We got time maybe for, I'm going to say 3 questions if we're quick, if that's all right, Jenny. There has been, unsurprisingly, a great deal of interest in this topic. So the first one I would like to ask of you is, has consideration been given to the impact of high penetration of DER on performance of existing power system protection schemes?
I guess I'm not entirely sure what you mean about existing power system protection schemes. That could mean a number of things. I'm not sure if whoever asked the question can clarify.
Came through anonymously, sorry.
I mean, I guess we've looked at certainly under frequency load shedding is a protection scheme that obviously we're looking at extensively. We're looking at over frequency generation shedding and making sure that that operates properly. We're looking at various other control schemes. For example, we spent a lot of time looking at the EAPT control scheme in Victoria to make sure that that is functioning optimally for the new conditions that we're moving into. And there's a lot of work on inverter protection through the AS4777 process, but I'm not sure if you're thinking about other types of protection in terms of network protection and how that operates in low system strength conditions, for example. That's not so much being looked at through our DER program at the moment, but more through the alternatives work streams looking at low system strength conditions in general. But would love to hear from you if there's a particular issue of concern that you've got in mind there that you think we should be looking at, but please email me if you've got thoughts on that.
Thanks very much for that, Jenny. Look, time for one more, and then those that we don't get to, is it all right if I send them through to you afterwards and we can probably populate some of the answers that you come up with? Is that okay on your end, Jenny?
Sorry, sure, yeah. I can't promise written answers to every question, but I will attempt I will attempt.
Thank you. The next one that we'll cover today before moving to our next presenter is, will grid forming inverters also help lower the minimum demand for secure NEM operation? How are standards and research and pilot projects addressing this?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And we do also have a very active parallel work stream around grid formation and how that will work. Some very big questions in South Australia, given that all of the work that's going on there and the very low demand levels that we're seeing. That would fall into the bucket of, if we can supply all of our system services through other mechanisms, such as grid forming inverters, then we don't need to operate with so many synchronous units online, which means that we can operate down to much lower levels of minimum demand. So it certainly will intersect with the work that we're doing on distributed PV, but I'm probably not the best place to comment on the progress on the work stream around grid forming inverters, because that sits with another team. So if you are interested in that, I can put you in touch with those folks if you send me an email afterwards.
Thank you very much for that, Jenny. Look, with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for your presentation today. It was clearly a very engaging topic, judging by the amount of questions that came through on the Slido, and I'm keen to see how this space progresses. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Alrighty, moving over to our next presenters today. We've got Peter Kilby and Dr. Terese Milford from Energy Queensland. I'm just going to, Terese and Peter, are you on the line and able to unmute? And...
Just as I have to ask you to share screen, Adrian.
Yes. I will do that now for
I'm
yourself.
here and ready to take over after Peter. Can you hear me, Adrian?
I can hear you. Awesome. All right, Peter.
Excellent. Thank you.
I'm going to make you presenter now. So feel free to start sharing your screen. And thank you to everyone's engagement on the Slido. It's been excellent. Apologies we can't get to all those questions, but we'll endeavour to answer some of the most interesting ones following the meeting today. But Peter, if you're able to share your screen, I'm happy to hand over to you to take it away.
Okay, hopefully you can see it now, Adrian.
Yes.
Conscious of time, so I'm going to try and be pretty quick. Ergon and Energex supply or distribute electricity across all of Queensland, of course. We supply more than 2 million customers and have lots of power lines. There's been massive growth in PV over the last decade. We've gone from the 10 megawatts to 5 gigawatts. In blue and orange is the sub 30 kVA systems. In green is the LV or the systems between 30 kilowatts and 5 megawatts, and then yellow is the solar farms connected on our sub-transmission network. There's also solar farms on Powerlink's network that aren't captured here. That's created a number of challenges. The first ones that really emerged on the distribution network were associated with voltage management, and we've done a large range of things to help integrate higher levels of PV by improving our voltage management. We've continued to target distribution transformer tap reductions at sites with high PV penetration. We've done widespread reductions on the medium voltage at the 11 and 22 kV levels to transition to the 230 volt standard, which has a lower limit of 216 volts. And that's given us increased headroom to accommodate reverse flows and the voltage rise associated with that. And we've also implemented wider applications of line drop compensation. It's also been called more recently enhanced voltage management, EVM. And now we're really using it to compensate for voltage rise. So we're pulling down the medium voltage during reverse flows to accommodate more reverse flows. We've seen the benefits of that with significant reductions in the levels of over voltage across our networks. And that's essentially reducing the levels of, I guess, PV trips and the like from PV systems, helping to manage the customer complaints associated with over voltage, and while at the same time increasing the PV penetration. Another key factor that Jenny briefly touched on is the smart inverters and the requirements in 4777 Part 2. Specifically, I wanted to refer to the voltage response modes, volt-var, which requires inverters to absorb reactive power when the voltage is above 240 volts, and also support the voltage levels when voltages go very low. and volt watt, which does require a limit on the maximum active power output when voltages exceed 253 volts. We can actually see the contributions from smart inverters now appearing at the bulk level. So this is a 110 kV bulk supply point, and you can see here in blue the active power flows, and so those flows are often going reverse during the middle of the day. This is shoulder season, spring last year, when we have quite modest loads and quite significant solar output. And you can see that actually our reactive power often peaks in the middle of the day when our reverse flows are most significant, and that's a result of the reactive power compensation from those distributed inverters. Another thing that I'd like to sort of sidetrack on a little bit here is how regularly we now see our reactive flows are capacitive. Historically, we've tended to assume that the reactive demand on our system is inductive, but during the middle of the night, we see consistently capacitive draw across all of our distribution networks now, and that only tends to disappear in the peaks, and also now in the middle of sunny days when all those inverters are providing reactive compensation. Okay, so this is just another way of presenting that plot. So on the x-axis, I have the active power, and on the y-axis, the vertical axis, I have reactive power. So you can get a feel for over the whole year the load on this bulk supply point, and you can see that the peak load on that substation was just over 70 megawatts, and at that time the power factor was probably about 0.998, I think. So that's quite a good power factor for peak load, historically speaking. And the other thing to note, of course, is that we've now got significant reverse flows happening. And we've also got a significant period of time when the reactive power is capacitive. That creates additional challenges for managing voltage and exacerbates our buck tap limitation. So all of our power transformers have typically been designed with OLTCs to support peak load, but the amount of buck taps they have to pull down voltage at minimum demand is somewhat limited, and that becomes even more of a challenge when you add capacitive flows that also push up the voltage. So just to contrast this data from 2020, yes, that's one other point, sorry, I wanted to highlight here was the reactive compensation. You can see that as a result of those reactive compensation is actually mitigating some of those capacitive flows when we do have the reverse flows, and that's those solar inverters contributing. In red here now, I've got the same PQ data for 2011, and you can see just how much the load on this has changed. Obviously, this is a sort of a new suburb, so we're getting load growth from under 50 megawatts, but we never historically had any capacitive demand, and we of course never had the flows on that network either. So it's quite a significant change there over the last decade. And finally, in green, just quickly, you can see those capacitive flows are continuing to reduce, and those reverse flows are continuing to increase. So now the whole point of our presentation, dynamic operating envelopes. We've defined a dynamic operating envelope, although sort of there's still work going to have a consistent definition nationally, as a dynamic operating envelope specifies a varying operating range at the connection point for exports and imports. This can apply to a range of distributed energy resources, including PV, batteries, and electric vehicles. It can be used in conjunction with autonomous DER responses, such as the volt fire response that I mentioned earlier, to ensure network and system constraints are not breached by DER operation. And it's important, I think, to clarify that a dynamic operating envelope differs from demand response in that they do not dispatch or target a response, but they specify the limits of active power input or export or import. Within the limits of that dynamic operating envelope, however, DER behavior is unaffected. While a dynamic operating envelope they're initially limited by existing visibility and systems, we expect that as capabilities scale and grid visibility increases, our dynamic operating envelopes that we send to active DER will be optimized further and be useful for a whole range of functions. So what are we talking about when we talk about dynamic operating envelopes? This is a traditional load profile I've been intentionally vague about the axis there, but this could be a local distribution transformer supplying a diversified load to a residential suburb with an evening peak. Of course, in the last decade, we've seen a dramatic rise in the level of PV that's connected. So on sunny days, as shown in yellow, that PV generates a significant amount of power, and that results in a net load that goes substantially negative. If we continue to connect more and more PV without managing that, we eventually reach these capacity constraints. So now when we're talking, or certainly from a distribution perspective, the reason we've been working towards dynamic operating envelopes is to manage those capacity constraints. We've quite effectively mitigated a lot of those voltage constraints that have emerged over the last decade, but now we're starting to see networks where the capacity of the network is being breached in the reverse direction. And so in order to manage this, dynamic operating envelopes are proposed. And they will act on the new actively managed systems to restrict their export on those days when there is an excessive amount of generation and a modest amount of local load. And that ensures that we can then maintain the reverse flow within the capacity constraints of that network. But I think valuable tool, certainly in the future, the sort of future, is that they can certainly be used in both directions. So we can just as easily generate a dynamic operating envelope to manage imports, and we can apply that to active DER, like electric vehicle batteries, just to ensure that their response, whether it be just to recharge or in response to VPP dispatch or the like, doesn't overload the network during peak demand periods. And finally, once again, just trying to highlight how dynamic operating envelopes and demand response can interact. We can see here, for example, a DER service that could be called to relieve a dynamic operating envelope, how it relieves that constraint in the middle of the day by charging an EV, for example, or by discharging a battery in the evening peak. I'd now like to hand over to Terese.
All right, thanks, Peter. As Peter sort of presented, what we're on at the moment, certainly at Energex and Ergon, I think at other distributors across the country, is really this path to enabling dynamic customer connections for DER. So today we're in this place where most of the customers are connected with a passive DER. It's a fixed export agreement. That level of export might be, the system size, might be partial or might be nil. But that level doesn't change with time, that maximum amount that the system can export to the network. Where we're kind of in the space of today is really about enabling this dynamic operation of DER, depending on the network conditions at the time. So as Peter sort of described, the idea is the networks that are changing all the time. And so how much additional export it can accommodate from DER, or how much additional import it can, supply, I guess, to charge batteries or the like, that's changing with time. And with operating envelopes, what we want to be able to do is, as close to near real time as possible, assess the network conditions, make that determination of how much export and import it can handle, and then publish those envelopes out to customers, aggregators to respond. And I guess in the future, what this is going to do is obviously it's going to be better for customers. Certainly people who are coming in late to the picture or at the ends or specific locations on the network may have more limitations on their export. But it really it's building a system and platform today that is going to enable those two-way markets, aggregators dispatching into the system. And then as we also mentioned, this idea of truly optimizing how that all works. So that's pretty much the journey that we're on at the moment. So what I'll talk you through now is this technology platform, we're calling it, that's going to support this transition. And what we're doing is things are moving so fast in this space. So what we want to do is, rather than wait till we have this, full-fledged optimal ideal solution, we're taking a staged approach, and we're I guess working towards that path, but trying to get as much benefit for customers as soon as possible. And so stage one is really about using available monitoring data to create that local operating envelope. So we have transformers that might have a transformer monitor. We're very fortunate that we have a few of those in Southeast Queensland. We're reading data from that monitor every 5 minutes, generating an operating envelope, which we're then publishing out to the internet. Stage two, Thanks, Peter. He's controlling his slides for me. Stage 2 is where we can, I guess, broaden the applicability of operating envelopes and the customers that we can, offer that to by using state estimation. So what we do there is we say, okay, the local distribution transformer or the local LV network doesn't have any monitoring, but there's other monitoring on the broader sort of medium voltage feeder or other low voltage networks off that same medium voltage feeder. So we supply the available monitoring data into the state estimator, and it's generating synthetic data. So a data stream very similar to what a transformer monitor might provide, but it's generated through state estimation. And that gives us better visibility. And in a similar way, we can generate sort of a basic operating envelope that then we can then publish out for systems to respond. Stage 3 is where we get into the start of this advanced optimization processes. So by using the state estimation, I guess, platform and its subsequent advanced network analytics tools, which I'll go into in a sec, we're getting a more comprehensive view of the constraints on the LV networks and the medium voltage networks in the vicinity, and how a sort of export or import in one area will influence others. So that's sort of where we get into this area of optimization. And stage 4 is when we get to the point where we have sufficient network models, monitoring, etc., to really roll this out all the way down to customer connections, so full low voltage network models as well. All right, so now I'll just talk you through a few of the terms, I guess, that I've brought up in this slide. So the first is this concept of state estimation or distribution system state estimation. State estimation is, it's been around for power systems for quite some time, fundamental to, what AEMO does at a transmission network level. Hasn't to date been widely used in distribution networks. They're so big, and the scale and complexity has really made it a challenge. But what we've done is, with some previous projects, collaborations with universities, other partners, arena funding as well, we've I guess worked on this novel state estimation technique, which can work on distribution networks, the type of data and network models that distribution network service providers are likely to have. We need the network model. We need some time series data, like from whatever monitoring is available on the network. And where we want to get to is where we also have forecast data. So if we can forecast some load and generation, the idea is we can generate operating envelopes into the future, which is going to be particularly important for aggregators to potentially plan how they might want to respond in these two-way markets. The next step after we have that network visibility is to undertake a bit of a constraint analysis. And what that's doing is identifying feasible options for our dynamically managed DER. So into this, we feed in operational and technical limits. So, what are the medium, low voltage limits that we want to stay within, limits on capacity, currents flowing through feeders. We might want to throw in limits on reverse flow through certain sections of network. So all of that feeds into this constraint analysis, as well as what is that DER that we are able to manage. The next step is the capacity constraint optimization. And this is where we can sort of throw in different, I guess, optimization preferences. So one example that I'll put out there is, at the moment, with the limited trials that we are doing in this space, we would consider adopting an equitable approach. So that means whatever network capacity is available to customers, we're going to sort of equally share that out proportionally to system size. That doesn't necessarily get the most renewable generation pumping back into the system. If you want to do that, then that's a different optimization approach. And what you might end up with, though, is customers on low voltage networks who are closer to their transformer, they're contributing more power exporting back into the network, but they can only do that if the customers at the end of the feeder are throttling back their export, because the ones at the end of the feeder are more likely to have export that's contributing to voltage rise. That means we're hitting a voltage limit, which means that we can't get any more export. So there's different optimization or allocation rules that'll need to come in here. And, part of it's technical, sort of be able to program that into the optimizer, and also really landing on those positions is sort of policy, regulation, customer engagement, and there's a whole heap of work going on in that space too. Then we lead to the generation of these dynamic operating envelopes. And that's really, as sort of Peter described, this range of operation, so that at the connection point, it describes export and import limits. The DER is operating behind the meter in a way such that, I guess, the load or self-consumption on site is considered, the generation at that time is considered, so that the overall impact is that customer site is staying within the export and import limits of this envelope. Next slide, I think. All right, so here I just want to show you a bit of a customer case studies. What does this actually look like? If we consider a customer who is trying to put a 100 kVA system on their roof, so this is not a typical house, this is more of a, I think this was a particular, it was a daycare centre, so more of a medium-sized customer. Unfortunately, the size of the system, the amount of PV in the network already, where they were located on the feeder, all of that basically meant that we couldn't offer them full export, because what we're doing today is, it's fixed export limits. We consider what is that worst case scenario, and can we handle an extra 100 kilowatts exporting into that sort of network state. So what we've done is, unfortunately, our customer is under a nil export agreement currently, but we said, okay, if we could have, dynamic operating envelopes operating, what would that look like? And what we can see is that, I guess we're right in that it can't handle 100 kilowatts exported into the system all the time. But what we can see is that operating envelope, if the customer could respond, would still enable a lot of export at other times, and the idea is that's what the network can handle, so we can offer that out to customers and they can take advantage of that network capacity sort of when and where it's available. Next slide. This is the last one. I think we'll whiz through this pretty quickly, but really to conclude, this continued DER uptake is indeed influencing network operation. I mean, from Jenny's presentation, you can certainly see that at system level, and we in distribution networks are seeing that locally as well, sort of on low voltage circuits. Networks have improved the way we can manage voltage, and certainly the improvements with inverters and the new standards coming in there are helping with that to mitigate that voltage rise that we're seeing. But it's not just voltage. If we want to support the levels of DER that ultimately is going to help us reach all our renewable goals, we need to also manage those capacity limits. And that's where operating envelopes really are going to be helpful and effective. Data, like this all comes back to really data. So, we have comms to devices, we have data being collected left, right, and center. How are we using that data to really enable these solutions that are going to support this modern electricity grid? So, state estimation is obviously one technique that we're working on, and operating envelopes are sort of an offshoot of having that improved visibility. We can generate basic operating envelopes, and as I mentioned, that's sort of that stage 1 and stage 2 version of our plan, with some basic local data, but certainly the estimation and the advanced analytics and optimization techniques helps us to get that broader view, get more on and support customers in that way. It's generation and it's loads. So, electric vehicles, home energy battery systems, they're not far off. And so we need to be able to have that, future viewpoint and connect to that future that we're all aiming towards. And one thing that I'll just sort of call out is the standards for DER connections and the interoperability between DER aggregators, DNSPs, that's going to be needed to support this future. And certainly our standards teams at Energex are going to working hard in this space. And that's pretty much it. I think there were some references there that Peter had included as well. So thanks, back to you, Adrian.
That was awesome. Thank you very much, both Peter and Terese, for running through all that in record time too. So well done. Very interesting space, and keen to see where it continues to grow to. Again, generated some great questions online. So I'm just going to jump to those that have been voted up at the top. Probably got time for at least 2. So to start with, and I'm not sure whoever wants to take this one, but will the dynamic operating envelope look to dispatch reactive power as well, or will this continue to be managed passively?
I might try that one. I think it's a good question. I think it's not yet answered. We're obviously starting with active power. I am at this stage very comfortable with reactive power being managed locally to mitigate local voltage constraints. The control loop for that response is 10 seconds when we're deploying dynamic operating envelopes on a 5-minute time horizon. I think it might be a bit restrictive on local voltage management to impose those on such a slower control loop. So yeah, I think initially certainly not, but potentially in the long term.
Awesome, thank you, Peter. Look, I think another one for yourself, because this came through when you were presenting. There was a particular slide that I think had some capacitive reactive power happening at night, and the question was, do we know, or do you know where that capacitive reactive power is coming from during the evenings?
That's another good question. I can't confirm where it's coming from. I can confirm that these changes in reactive demand have been seen internationally. One of the references is from the UK, where they've seen similar things happening over the last decade. So that suggests that at least part of it is related to the change in the types of loads that customers had. I'd suggest there's a lot more power electronic loads. Most of our appliances these days have inverter front ends, which mean that they probably have just a very good power factor. I mean, these things don't have the lower power factors that old inductive motors and things had. But there's potentially a small amount of capacitance coming from them. Potentially other sources would be increasing use of underground cables and the like. But I'm confident at least a portion of it is the changing customer load.
Awesome, thanks, Peter. Now one for you, Terese. Have you considered in your architecture for LV monitoring and including the metering data, potentially 5-minute data intervals that's at the edge of the network?
Yes, certainly we're looking to incorporate data from customer premises, from houses. We are starting a bit more work in that space. We did one sort of trial on a low voltage network where we saw sort of about 25% coverage, got us reasonable visibility with that full low voltage network model. What we're also, I guess, considering is that it might be some time before we fully modeling low voltage networks as part of our state estimator. We can get a lot of value just by modeling the medium voltage feeder from the zone substation down to the LV terminals of the distribution transformer. But even with that level, what we can do is incorporate that LV data from, retail meters or other monitors downstream, I guess. And the idea is there's less unknown load then that needs to be estimated or accounted for on that distribution transformer, that LV circuit. So we can, take consideration what we do know from feeders, aggregating various loads, different voltage references, and then that will improve the accuracy of the state estimation work.
I might just add a key requirement is, of course, near real-time data. So traditionally, meters haven't provided that, but if where that's available, that's certainly very interested in leveraging that visibility.
And that, I guess I'll sort of add, one of the other things is that with the standards and the interoperability that we're working on, one of the requirements is going to be some form of telemetry coming back from those dynamic enabled customers.
Yep, makes sense. Thanks, Terese and Peter. Look, got probably last one, and maybe this one sits in your area, Peter. Are studies currently being done on the impact of high levels of DER on the settings or / the existence of under voltage load shedding schemes?
Yes, I'm not sure what we're talking about with under voltage load shedding. I think there's still so certainly UFLS. I mean, we're working on improving the as Jenny pointed to in South Australia, we're working on upgrading our UFLS systems to distinguish between reverse flowing feeders. I think on under voltage, the idea is with the new inverters that they can ride through those under voltages, but we wouldn't typically be shedding systems or parts of the network just based on under voltage, I don't think. I might be mistaken though.
All good. Look, I will go one more because I think it's a quick answer, and maybe to you, Terese. What is the customer benefit or additional value for expecting more energy? The question here is if they get nothing for it, but maybe just elaborate on what's the benefit for customers under the DOE.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the benefit for customers, you know, taking that example that I put up there, you know, there are going to be increasingly customers who are export limited if we continue on the path that we're on. And, you know, so the idea is if there is capacity on the network that can handle export, then, you know, customers can have that accessible to them. I guess the revenues or tariffs associated with those exports, that's kind of going to be dependent on their retailer or aggregators or the like. But I guess then it's also supporting the fact that we have more renewables on the network, which is more contributing to that power system level of less other generation, more cheaper sources of generation, which hopefully overall will drive power prices down for everyone.